The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is the classic tale of deja vu. Last year, I released a video where I tried playing through the entire game using only young Link, and never turning into adult Link. After I released that video, I got several comments wondering if it would be possible to do the opposite, and play through the entire game as adult Link after skipping the young Link section. At first, I didn't think this would be very interesting. After all, you're supposed to play most of the game as adult Link. I even responded to these comments at the time, explaining why I thought it was possible. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to wonder. Although it's true that most of the game is supposed to be played as adult Link, they still expect you to have gotten a bunch of items and things as young Link before you become adult Link, like Zelda's Lullaby, bombs, the Ocarina itself, and more. And I also got some comments from other people who said they tried it themselves and didn't think it was possible. So I decided to find out for myself and try beating Ocarina of Time using only adult Link. Here are the rules I used. First, the game obviously starts you as young Link, but I'm not allowed to make any actual progress with him. I have to somehow turn into an adult without obtaining any items. I allowed myself to get stuff like Deku Sticks to make doing this easier, as long as I get rid of them all before turning into an adult. Second, once I am an adult, I need to make it into every dungeon, defeat the boss at the end of each, and collect the stone or medallion from each. Those are the only two rules. As long as I'm using adult Link, everything's fair game. So let's get started. After giving my character the canon name, he woke up at home in Kokiri Forest. Normally, you're supposed to gather money to buy a shield from the shop, and find the sword elsewhere in the forest. But instead, I just gathered 5 rupees to buy 1 Deku Stick from the shop. Once I had it, I went to the Lost Woods, and navigated through it until I reached the pool that leads to Zora's River. Normally, you can use this as a shortcut to and from Zora's River once you get the silver scale so you can dive. But by positioning Link here, waiting for Navi to have something to tell me, then mashing the button for the Deku Stick to make Link slash with it twice and then pressing the button for Navi, Link will fall off the ledge, and Navi's text being on screen will make Link fall through the water to the bottom. Press A to get rid of the text box, then hold in the direction of the warp, and Link was out of the forest with nothing. The river itself gives you rupees if you swim in it, so I walked to Hyrule Field. From there I walked to Hyrule Castle Town, broke my Deku Stick, and made it into town with absolutely no items to my name. I headed to the Temple of Time. My objective now was to get past the Door of Time so I could turn into adult Link, but without the spiritual stones or the Song of Time, I couldn't open the door. So instead, I went into this corner, lined up like this, then exited first person mode and held Z to target. I held down very lightly on the stick, then pressed A, which made Link roll. And then I held down on the stick all the way and mashed A, which made him side hop. I started pausing repeatedly after the side hop started. You can pause repeatedly to do something called pause buffering, which basically allows you to advance the game a single frame at a time, which lets you pull off tricks that are frame perfect or require tricky timing. I released all of my inputs and buffered to this first frame where Link was no longer visible, then held down Z again. A few frames later, I held left on the stick, and Link did a weird out-of-bounds jump and ended up behind the door, which let me get past it without opening it. And just like that, I'd made it to the Master Sword with absolutely nothing on me. I pulled the Master Sword, turned into adult Link, and got the Light Medallion, which meant the adventure was truly underway. After the cutscenes, I was met by my first obstacle. Since I didn't actually open the Door of Time, it was still closed, which meant I was locked inside the Master Sword room. Luckily, by just saving and resetting the game, I get put in the main room of the temple. Also, interestingly, despite the Door of Time being closed, the game put the spiritual stones on the pedestal even though I didn't have them. Other weird things I noticed were that on Adult Link's equipment screen, there was a hover boots icon on the left, where passive equipment like quivers and gauntlets usually go, and he was equipped with a stack of 0 bombs on a C button, even though I didn't even have bombs to equip. My first objective was to gather some items. I headed to Kokiri Forest first, where I was very pleased to find that by entering the forest and then going back out, I was able to get the fairy ocarina from Saria, who was supposed to be inside the forest temple. It still looks like the Ocarina of Time when Adult Link holds it, but I got to keep the fairy ocarina in my inventory, which was pretty cool. Also, I tried to equip the ocarina over the fake stack of bombs, and it moved the bombs to another C button and highlighted the empty bomb slot in the item screen, even though I couldn't actually move my cursor to it. Very weird. Since I didn't have a shield, I had no way to defend against the monsters, so I was taking quite a bit of damage. I decided to see if the Great Deku Tree would be closed even though I never did the dungeon as a kid, and sure enough it was. But I wasn't ready to take on that dungeon yet anyway, so I left the forest and headed for Kakariko. Luckily, the gate to Death Mountain was not locked, even though I'd never opened it as a kid. I decided to check out the mountain trail, and I was surprised to find that Dodongo's cavern was also open, despite me never blowing up the boulder blocking the entrance. I went to the Kakariko graveyard and got the Hylian shield, then went to Dampé's grave to get the hookshot. After getting the hookshot, I went into the exit of the grave, but since I didn't have the Song of Time, I got completely locked in there. so I saved and reset again to escape, and then headed back to Dodongo's cavern. Bombs are useful for many glitches and tricks in this game, so I wanted to get them as soon as possible. But when I arrived at the dungeon, I was surprised to find that adult Link couldn't pick up the bombs. Normally, you get the Goron bracelet so that he can pick these up as a kid, but then he doesn't need it as an adult and doesn't wear it. But apparently, he just concealed it all this time, because he's just as weak as he is as a kid. This actually posed a much bigger problem than you might think. To break open this entrance, you have only 4 options. A bomb chew, the Megaton hammer, or apparently, blue fire in a bottle. Unfortunately, most of these options were out of the picture. I would need way more items to get to the hammer in the fire temple. The only bottle you can get as an adult requires you to already have at least one from the child section, and the entire point of coming to this dungeon was to get bombs in the first place. So the only option I had was to use bomb chews. Unfortunately, those aren't easy to come by either. The easiest way to get them at this point, which still wasn't very easy at all, would be to buy a set of 10 bomb chews for 200 rupees from the seller in the Haunted Wasteland, which would require me to cross the bridge to Gerudo Valley without the Longshot or Epona. But before any of that, I had to first expand my wallet so it could even hold 200 rupees. To do that, I had to get 10 Skulltula tokens. Since the number you can get with so few items is pretty limited, I got a few using some tricks and glitches. For example, on Death Mountain Trail, I clipped the hookshot inside of this rock to get one without having to break the rock, and at Lake Hylia, I positioned Link here, then fired the hookshot at this point on the tree, which made him stand on top of a root that normally makes you slide off. This gave me enough height to hookshot the top of the tree, and then by mashing B, I was able to jump slash and reach the top for another Skulltula. Also, there were some in the Sacred Forest Meadow, but since I never got Saria's song, I couldn't get Mido out of my way to get there. But by standing next to him, pulling out the hookshot, aiming around here, then holding Z and backflipping, I was able to just jump over him to get to the meadow. I got a Skulltula there, and then headed to the very first room of the Forest Temple for another, which was my 10th. Sheik also taught me the song to warp back to the Forest Temple, which meant that when I decided to complete it later on, I could warp back instead of having to skip Mido again. I headed back to Kakariko and cashed in the tokens for the wallet upgrade, then farmed for rupees until I was up to 200, and then I could finally head to Gerudo Valley. My first goal was to get across the bridge. This is supposed to be impossible without either Epona or the Longshot, but with a particular setup, it's actually possible with a regular hookshot too. I got into this spot by this post, then did 3 side hops to the right. I held target, rolled forward, released target and turned right, held target again to center the camera, then released it again and held shield. I held up while shielding, then briefly released the shield while still holding up, which inched Link forward a tiny bit at a time. I did this 3 times, then pulled out the hookshot. The hookshot still can't reach the other side from here, but by holding up, pressing A to cancel the hookshot, and then immediately pulling out the hookshot again, your range will actually be extended just barely enough to reach the other side. And with that, I headed into the fortress. A guard blocked the gate to the Haunted Wasteland, and I didn't have any way of knocking her out, so I went through the fortress and rescued the carpenters, which got me the membership card, letting me move through the fortress without the guard stopping me. From there, I headed into the Haunted Wasteland. My first obstacle was this quicksand, but I was able to just backwalk over it near this side. And then, there he was, the carpet merchant at long last. I jumped off the bridge and jump slashed to make it up to him without the hover boots, and at long last I bought my bomb shoes. Remember, everything I had been doing for the past while, getting Skulltulas, making it to the valley, doing the fortress, all of it was to get my hands on a single set of these. But since I was already here, I decided to go the rest of the way to the Spirit Temple. You can make it through the desert without the Lens of Truth if you know the route, so I did that, and Sheik taught me the song so I could warp back there when I actually wanted to do the temple later on. Then I saved and reset to get back to the Temple of Time, and finally headed back to Dodongo's cavern. Since I'd saved the carpenters, the bridge to Gerudo Valley was fixed, so I could now get back there without needing to line up like I did before, but I actually forgot about that as I was playing, so I wanted to conserve my bomb shoes as much as possible since I only had 10. Inside of Dodongo's cavern, I used a bomb chew to finally open the path. Adult Link actually trivializes a huge portion of this dungeon, because he's tall enough to hop to this switch that normally requires a ton of travel to get to. From there, I went to the room with the bombs surrounding the staircase, and used a bomb chew to explode them. I headed upstairs, and soon reached this room. From here I just jumped to the left, and Link was tall enough to grab the ledge, and from there I hopped over to the bomb bag chest. Regular bombs are much easier to restock than bomb chews are, so I was glad to finally have them. Since I was already here, I decided to finish this dungeon as the first one. From the chest, I left the room and bombed the eyes to open the way to the end of the dungeon, and Adult Link's height once again trivialized this section, because I was able to just jump up to the block, skipping the entire last section of the dungeon. King Dodongo was no different than normal, so I took him down quickly. And considering how much I had to do just to gain access to the dungeon, it was quite satisfying to just destroy the entire thing in minutes. Speaking of destroyed, the cutscene that followed was also destroyed by all the glitches I had done to get to it. Darunia miraculously returned from being a sage and smashed his hand through Link's head. Then Link was taller than the developers expected, so when he gets knocked down, he's actually still visible, which makes the scene a lot funnier. He's just knocked out on the ground while Darunia does his speech. And then when Darunia gave me the ruby, him and Link both held their arms up like usual, but the ruby itself actually didn't appear. And then this grown adult ran away in fear from the Gorons. All in all, an amazing cinematic experience. Next I headed back to Kokiri Forest, and farmed more rupees so I could buy the maximum of 10 Deku Sticks. That might seem pointless considering adult Link can't use them, but you'll see soon enough why I wanted these. One thing I wasn't super pleased about was that you can only get bomb bag upgrades as a kid. That meant I could only hold a maximum of 20 bombs for the entire game. The maximum for bomb chews is always 50, so I could hold a maximum of 70 explosives at once, but I'd have to farm for hundreds of rupees, buy one set of 10 from the vendor in the desert, and repeat every time I wanted more. In any case though, I was going to need to use quite a few of them now. I started by activating the infinite sword glitch. When you slash with your sword and interrupt it with certain other actions, like reading a sign or grabbing a bomb, then you'll be permanently attacking with your sword until you do certain other actions, like slashing the sword again yourself. This glitch has some other effects. If you backflip into an explosion while shielding, you'll float in midair. So using this trick, you can gain height infinitely, at least until you run out of explosives. After activating the glitch, I walked up to the top of this route on this house, then hovered up to the wall surrounding the village. The infinite sword glitch prevents you from falling off ledges, so even though the collision up here isn't perfect, I was able to walk around without jumping off into the abyss. I ran west until around this point, then slashed my sword to cancel the infinite sword glitch. Then I rolled off of this point and jump slashed towards the end of my jump, to make it back in bounds on the trail to the Deku Tree. Since I hadn't gotten here the normal way, the Deku Tree area hadn't actually been loaded properly. It was invisible, but the basic geometry was still there, so I was able to walk in it. The Deku Tree's mouth also wasn't loaded, but the loading zone into the dungeon behind it was. What this meant is that I was able to just run forward to where the Deku Tree was supposed to be to enter the dungeon. Now, when I first entered the dungeon, I actually expected to take it on mostly like normal. I got the slingshot for fun even though I couldn't use it, saved and reset to get back to the entrance since I couldn't knock down the ladder, then went to the basement. Adult Link's height once again allowed me to trivialize this section, but the problem came after this. Once I got to the spiderweb that led to the end of the dungeon, I used a simple glitch called Equip Swap to equip the Deku Sticks onto Adult Link. I thought this would work, but it turns out that the game really does not like it when you do that. This was on the Nintendo Switch Online app. I did some reading in the Ocarina of Time speedrunning Discord later on, and apparently if you load Pokemon Stadium 2 before Ocarina of Time, then this actually works. I have no idea why that would be, but in any case, I didn't find that out until much later, so I had to find another way to get down to the boss. Fortunately, there was another solution. I headed back up to the top of the dungeon, and entered the room with the 3 rising platforms. Normally, your goal is to use these to get through the room before they fall, but instead, I did the complete opposite. I stepped on the switch to make the platforms rise, then immediately ran for the wall beside the switch, targeted to make Link face it, then turned around and held target again. Then, without releasing target at all during the coming steps, I side-hopped to the right all the way through the room until I hit the wall, did a slash with the sword, a backflip, a side-hop, and then held up lightly on the stick, and Link grabbed onto the platform in a specific position. When the platforms fell, Link was put through the floor. Then I pressed A to let go, and immediately pressed B to jump slash. Since I never let go of target, Link had kept his diagonal angle, so he recoiled off of the platform and fell right down into the loading zone for the boss room. The fight itself was very easy. One mechanic worth pointing out are crouch stabs. Crouch stabs are glitched in this game, and always take the power of the last attack you did. So by jump slashing and then crouch stabbing repeatedly, every crouch stab had the power of a jump slash, letting me defeat Goma very quickly. I got the heart container, but I decided not to get the Kokiri's Emerald for now as a precaution. If you saw my last video on this game, then you might know why, but if not, avoiding that cutscene just gave me the option to do a certain glitch later on. Though as a slight spoiler, I did end up just getting the Kokiri's Emerald later on. So I went back to the entrance, farmed rupees for a bit, and then headed to Zora's River. Now since I never got Zelda's Lullaby, I couldn't get rid of the waterfall blocking the entrance to Zora's domain. So instead, I went to the ladder around halfway up the river. I climbed up it, turned around, backflipped, rolled, performed a slash, then turned left and side hopped to the right. This clipped Link through the platform. He grabbed onto the ledge, but since the ladder was there, he grabbed onto the inside of the platform. Then I let go of the platform, and he fell through the ground and out of bounds. The water in this game extends downwards infinitely, so I was able to pull Link into the river's water down here, and from there, I navigated using the minimap. I swam until he was around the bridge, then let him surface. Now he was back in bounds, but similar to the Deku Tree, the way I got here prevented the game from loading this section of the area properly. The waterfall was gone, but the actual geometry and loading zones were still there. So I just awkwardly navigated around until I reached the loading zone and got inside. But that was just the first of many obstacles. King Zora was still frozen, and since I had never moved him as a kid, he's frozen in front of the entrance to Zora's fountain. First of all, I wanted to unfreeze him. This isn't actually necessary, but I just wanted to get the Zora tunic for fun. I went up to the throne room to load King Zora, then kept the camera aimed that way and walked back down the stairs until he was unloaded. I aimed the camera at the wall, and went up the stairs until I got back up to the throne room, then inched Link left until he could read the sign. After he did, I walked back down the stairs until the king was unloaded again, walked back up, and just like that he's unfrozen, which made him give me the tunic. He was still in my way though, so next, I got into this corner. I lined up like this in first person mode, then jump slashed at the wall and clipped right through. I walked into the wall a bit further, then jumped out of bounds. Once I was falling, I held Link in the direction of the water behind King Zora. Like I mentioned before, water extends downwards infinitely, and even though the place is frozen over, the water still exists under the ice. So once I was in the water, I just let Link surface, and then walked outside like normal. Now unlike the Deku Tree in Dodongo's cavern, Jabu Jabu isn't here at all when you're an adult, but the loading zone to get inside him actually is still here. To get inside, I activated the infinite sword glitch, then got into this corner and aligned with this fence. I did 2 backflips, then pressed A to roll and released target during the roll. Then I pressed target again, did a side hop to the left, then pressed A to roll and released target during the roll again. Finally, I held target again, side hopped right, then pressed A to roll again, but didn't release target during it this time. And then I ran forward until Link was at the edge. Since the infinite sword glitch was active, he didn't jump off. Now I pulled out a bomb chew, and pause buffered until it flashed red for a 9th time. When it did, I side hopped right while shielding, and Link was now hovering in this little gap here, slightly submerged in the water. Then I held up right on the control stick. If you hold up right while in this position, Link will do this kind of strafe looking walk. But as you bring the control stick from upright closer to straight up, he changes to walking diagonally. I kept moving the stick up until he started the diagonal walk, and then went a tiny bit further beyond that. Then I pulled out another bomb chew. Using pause buffering again, I waited until it flashed red 8 times, and as soon as it went blue after the 8th red flash, I paused again, held shield and right on the stick, then continued pause buffering. This made Link drop the bomb chew. I continued pause buffering until Link leaned to the right. On this frame when I unpaused, I pressed A, and Link performed a roll. Then I pause buffered one more time until I saw this frame of the bomb chew's explosion, and then I side hopped to the left while shielding. Doing all of this clipped Link into the loading zone for Jabu Jabu, letting me get inside. The first section of the dungeon wasn't too different from a regular playthrough. Obviously, adult Link's height made it easier to get around, but I went through the rooms mostly like you're supposed to. The hookshot was able to activate the switches, so not being able to use the slingshot wasn't much of an issue. Soon enough I got the boomerang, and although it appears invisible in adult Link's hand, when you throw it it becomes visible, and functions identically to how it does for young Link. This was all I really needed from the dungeon, and skipping the rest of the dungeon would only require a very simple bomb hover, but since the trick to get in here was so precise, and had taken me so long to do, I wanted to spend more time in here. So I decided to play the whole thing. It wasn't that different from normal until the room with the big octo, where the Zora Sapphire was weird and small, and didn't seem to move as Princess Ruto interacted with it. The weird tiny Sapphire also stayed there for the entire fight, and even made the spiritual stone sound the entire time. The rest of the dungeon was no different than normal, and then I took on the boss, who was also no different than normal with the boomerang equipped. I got the heart container, got the sapphire, and then warped to the forest temple. I was initially expecting this to be fairly similar to a regular playthrough, but I quickly found several issues. For example, there's a block that requires you to play the Song of Time to remove it, and I couldn't push the blocks in this room since Link didn't have the Goron bracelet or any other strength upgrades. Fortunately, I was able to do some glitches to get through. The ground jump glitch let me climb onto some of them, and at the top of the room, I was able to hover up to the exit. And from there, I only had to go a little further to do the fight that got me the bow. And with that, I was ready to get this place finished. I saved the game and reset to return to the temple entrance, and then I headed back to the main room. I headed for the north side of the room and got into this corner. I targeted the wall to face it, then rolled into this corner. Then I went into first person mode and lined up so that the letter T in the word return was to the right of the pillar in front of me. I backflipped, went into first person mode, and lined up again, but this time lining up the letter R with the right side of the pillar. Then I backflipped again, and Link hopped over the wall and grabbed onto the ledge of the platform I was on. I climbed up, and he was now kind of within the railing. Then I lined up again in first person mode, so that the letter R in return was aligned with the side of the dark entryway in the distance, and walked slowly forward until I reached the end of the platform. Finally, I went into first person mode again, and aligned the letter R with this lighter colored pillar here. Then I walked slowly forward, and Link fell inside the platform and grabbed a ledge inside it. I let go, and he fell inside. From here, getting to the boss was fairly simple. I walked inside the platform to get Link close to the stairs, turned around to the north, then ran forward and jumped into the abyss, and followed it with a jump slash. This gave Link enough distance to fall into the loading zone for the boss room. Once inside, the boss itself was essentially the same as ever. With that, I got the heart container and got my first proper medallion. After that, I went outside and replenished my bombs. This is also the point where I remembered that the bridge to Gerudo Valley would be fixed, so I decided to stock up on bomb chews as well. It took quite a bit of time, but I eventually managed to cap them out. Next I headed for the Death Mountain crater. To get to the Fire Temple entrance, I did a mega flip. To do it, you put down a bomb, then back away until the A button says attack instead of grab. Then just before it explodes, you roll into it and then immediately backflip. If you get the timing right, Link gets sent flying backwards. There wasn't actually a need to do this, I just thought it would be fun to get the Fire Temple warp song, and then go into Goron Village from the crater to get the Goron tunic. Doing things in kind of a reverse order. It just seemed like fun. Going into the temple, my game plan was basically the same as what I did for the Forest Temple. I was planning to go through it normally until I got the hammer, and then skip to the boss. This was mainly because there were obstacles like Song of Time blocks, and heavy blocks that I couldn't push. For the most part, since I had already gotten a lot of items, like bombs, arrows, and the hookshot, the dungeon went mostly the same as normal. Other than this room, where, since I couldn't push the heavy block, I had to hover up on top of it and then climb from there to the platforms above. When I eventually got my hands on the hammer, I was already so close to the end of the dungeon that I ended up just doing it normally. I got the heart container and got the next medallion. Next up was the water temple. I didn't have all the items I needed to get into the temple, so I walked up to the lakeside laboratory. I walked into this corner until Link's top half started to clip inside, turned around, then backflipped to end up inside it. Once inside, I jumped into this gap in the ground. Like I explained in Zora's Domain earlier, water extends downwards infinitely, so I was able to swim out of it to fall, and then pull Link back in to re-enter the water from lower down. Once I was pretty far down, I swam for the water temple entrance, and made it inside without needing any items at all. Inside the temple, I was faced with a bit of a roadblock. To change the water levels and get through the dungeon, you're supposed to play Zelda's Lullaby next to these Triforce plaques on the walls. Since I didn't have Zelda's Lullaby, I couldn't do that. But the item you get from this dungeon is the long shot, which I didn't really feel like I needed since I could hover, so I decided to just skip the entire dungeon. In the first room, there's a target you're supposed to hit with the long shot to reach the boss, but I just hovered over to the platform. Once I was across, I went through the door behind the target, walked up the ramp, and approached the boss door. I didn't have the boss key, but fortunately, just like in the Forest Temple, I can skip it. I started by doing 2 bomb hovers into the air. Then I dropped a bomb and pulled out the sword just as it exploded. Pulling out the sword cancels the infinite sword glitch and sends Link back down to the ground, and the bomb's explosion clips him through the door. And with that, I got the heart container, got the next medallion, and headed off. Next, I went and replenished my bomb chews. Then I headed back to Kakariko. Sheik taught me the Nocturne of Shadow, which would let me warp to the Shadow Temple. But there was a problem. To open up the temple entrance, you need to use either Din's fire or fire arrows to light the torches. However, both of those require the use of magic, which I couldn't get because I didn't have Zelda's Lullaby, which is required to activate the fairy fountain that gives you the magic meter. So I needed to find an alternate way into the temple. I headed to the graveyard, then got up on top of Dampé's house. I activated the infinite sword glitch, and then hovered until I made it on top of the wall surrounding the graveyard. The infinite sword glitch prevented me from falling off, so I made my way along the wall until I got to the eastern end of the map. I walked to this spot so I was above the stairs leading down to the temple, then turned to the side and side hopped. This gave me enough distance to make it down to the torch room, but like with the Deku Tree in Zora's River, the way I got here made it so the area down here didn't load properly, so I was able to just walk into the loading zone for the entrance and get inside. I played through the first section of the temple like normal, which let me get my hands on the hover boots. Now, if you're familiar with this game, then you'll know that later on in the dungeon, you have to ride a boat that you activate with Zelda's Lullaby. Since I couldn't do that, I had to skip it, and I was going to do that from this very room. I went up to this side of the chest, then held target to line up with it. I side hopped to the left, backflipped, and pulled out the sword. Then I released target and pressed right on the control stick very lightly twice to make Link perform 2 very tiny turns to the right. Then I held target again, held left on the control stick, and pressed B 3 times to perform 3 horizontal slashes. On the third slash, I started pause buffering until this frame, where Link's sword hand was covered by his head. On this frame, I equipped the hover boots. Then I advanced 3 more frames until it looked like this, and then, without releasing target, I pressed the button for the hookshot. And that series of actions I just took made Link clip through the wall. After staying in the air for a moment because of the hover boots, he fell all the way down to the room that has the boss key door in it. However, as has happened a number of times in this video so far, because I didn't get here normally, the room was only partially loaded, and was invisible, so I had to navigate my way to the boss door. But since this room is full of holes you're supposed to get across using the hover boots, that wasn't as easy as it had been for those previous areas. So to do it, I held down shield, then held down on the control stick and briefly released shield and then held it again, so that Link turned around like this. Then I did a side hop to the left, and released target during the roll and then held it again. Then started holding up and mashing A to roll across the platforms. From here, I watched the glow of the hover boots around Link's feet. The glow disappears instantly when you walk onto a platform, and appears when you're hovering in midair. When it disappeared for a second time, I knew I had made it to the second platform, so I brought Link back so he was standing on that platform, and then went upright to reach the platform with the boss key door. Unfortunately, even though the other areas I had loaded weirdly like this had removed obstacles that were in my way, this wasn't one of those cases, and despite being invisible, the boss key door was still there. You can skip the boss key door in this dungeon, but it's not nearly as simple as the other ones, and I also had to do it with the added challenge of the room being invisible. I moved around the platform until I figured out which side the door was on. It's the only side you can't walk off of. Once I found it, I got up against it so Link's left side was touching it, shielded, then held left on the stick and stabbed twice. The recoil put Link into this position. Then I backwalked off the ledge and climbed back up. Without moving, I pulled out a bomb chew and let it flash red 3 times. When it started to dim after the third red flash, I pause buffered until the frame where it was at its darkest, then backwalked off the ledge again, which sent the bomb chew running. I immediately climbed back up and then held left. I started pause buffering again, and did so until this frame, where I pressed A to make Link roll. Then I pause buffered again, until the very first frame where Link grabbed onto the ledge, and then pressed target. The positioning and timing of all of this caused the bomb chew's explosion to clip Link through the boss door, which let him touch the loading zone to get into the boss room. I got the heart container, and collected the second last medallion. After that, I headed back to Kakariko Village. I already had the warp song to the Spirit Temple from earlier, so I could head there right this second if I wanted, but there were 2 things I wanted to take care of before I did that. First, I talked to this lady, and got the pocket egg. This thing will hatch into a pocket cuckoo later. Why is this important? It isn't at all. This accomplishes nothing. I just wanted to bring this little friend with me for the rest of the adventure. And the other thing I wanted to do was replenish my bombs. With that done, I warped to the Spirit Temple. I was met with my first roadblock almost immediately. To get to the Adult Link section of the dungeon, you're supposed to push this block using the silver gauntlets, which you get from the Young Link section of this dungeon. Since I didn't have any strength upgrades, I couldn't push it, so instead, I got onto this railing, lined up around here in first person mode, then jumped off and got up onto this statue. Then I put on the hover boots and ran off the statue, turning and running in the direction of the block once I got close, so I could grab onto it. Link grabbed it, and like in the Forest Temple, when he climbed up he went through the roof, which allowed me to walk on top of the block out of bounds, and jump off in the direction I wanted to go. From there I went through the dungeon normally, for 1 room. Yeah, I only wanted to get a small key from this section, because I thought it might make it easier to get through my actual destination. A lot of this dungeon wants you to use things like the silver gauntlets in Zelda's Lullaby, which meant traveling through it without them would be tricky. So instead, I decided to eliminate most of the traveling. I headed back outside of the dungeon. The silver gauntlets and the mirror shield are actually both placed outside of the dungeon, and you access them by traveling through the inside of it. So that meant that all I had to do to get access to both of them was to just get up to them from out here. I think you can see where I'm going with this. I activated the infinite sword glitch, and then I walked up against this wall around here. I held target to align with it, and then I backflipped. Then I pressed A to roll, and released target during the roll. This gave me the angle I wanted. I walked into the corner between the pillar and the wall in front of me, then pressed A to roll until Link stopped moving when I did. Then I side hopped to the left twice, briefly shielded without releasing target, then did one more roll by pressing A. From here, I pulled out a bomb, ran backwards until I was at the bottom of the stairs, dropped the bomb, ran back up the stairs, and backflipped into the explosion while shielding to start my hover. I put on the hover boots, and did 5 more hovers backwards using bomb chews. For one of them, however, I had to make sure to tap Z in the brief moment the bomb chew was out of Link's hands. When you're in a hover, the camera acts as if you're holding down Z to target, even if you're not. But if you actually target something with Z, you can release it to exit the targeting mode. So, while holding down on the control stick, I tapped R and A to shield the bomb chew and backflip, and tapped Z quickly while doing that to target the bomb chew in the brief moment it was out of my hands. This let me get out of targeting mode. I held up left slightly, then briefly released the stick and then immediately tapped down at Z, to lock the camera and Link's angle this way instead. This allowed me to continue my hover, but in the direction of the temple itself. I did 5 more of these, at which point I switched back to the Kokiri boots, and did 2 backflips, which put Link on this little bit he could stand on. And from there, I just walked up the seam, pulled out the hookshot, and used it to pull myself up to the chest, which finally got me the silver gauntlets. Now I wanted to get the mirror shield. The mirror shield was on the statue's other hand, across the wide gap. To get to it, I aimed Link towards the corridor that led back into the temple. Then I held target, pulled out a bomb, shielded to drop it, rolled forward once, then backflipped and held shield. From this position, I waited until the bomb was just about to explode, and then I mashed A. With good timing, this made Link shoot backwards with incredible speed. I paused immediately and equipped the hover boots, then unpaused and kept holding shield for a few moments. Then I released it and pressed B, and Link performed a jump slash that gave him just enough extra height to reach the other side. I walked into the corridor to make the chest spawn, and the mirror shield was mine. Since I'd skipped all the way to the mirror shield, I actually ended up working my way backwards through the dungeon, fighting the iron knuckle to open the way back rather than forward. However, the boss key here is behind a door that requires Zelda's Lullaby to open, so once I got to the boss door, I had to clip into the boss room. Fortunately, this one isn't hard at all. It's very similar to the one I used in the water temple. I got into this corner, then did the exact same setup. The timing for this one seems a little bit more precise than the water temple one, so when I dropped the bomb to the ground, I pause buffered until the frame where the bomb turns red and is bigger just before the bomb explodes, and pressed B on that frame to fall back down and clip through the door. And with that, I'd skipped the entirety of the child section of the dungeon, and the vast majority of the adult section. And with that I got the heart container, and collected the final medallion. After that, I headed back to the Temple of Time, where Zelda gave me the light arrows before promptly getting crystalled. Now, there was an obvious problem here. The way to Ganon's castle was open, which meant I was free to head in, and once I was inside, I was able to easily skip past the trials by doing a simple trick. I headed into the Spirit Temple room, pulled the closest statue over to this spot, then jump slashed into the gap between the statue and the door to clip through. This let me get back into the unloaded main room, and from there I could just navigate in the dark, until I made it to the loading zone for the tower. I can fight my way up the tower and make it to Ganondorf just fine, but this is where that problem comes into play. Without magic, even though I had the light arrows, I couldn't actually use them, which meant I couldn't beat the fight. This was actually the biggest roadblock I had faced in the entire playthrough. I didn't have Zelda's Lullaby, so I couldn't use fairy fountains, which meant I couldn't get magic. I couldn't get any bottles as Adult Link, which meant I couldn't do the crazy glitches that allow you to modify your inventory and status. And I couldn't get my hands on any cutscene items that would allow me to do a wrong warp to Ganon from the Deku Tree, which meant I had no way to skip past the Ganondorf fight. And because things like stale reference manipulation require setups that are dependent on a ton of factors, including the platform you're playing on, that was out of the picture as well. So I only had 2 options here. I either had to find some way to get a bottle as Adult Link, or I had to find some way to learn Zelda's Lullaby after all. There was no other way to complete the game. So I spent a few days researching tricks and glitches I had never heard of, and find they weren't possible for one reason or another. Many setups I found required bottles, and if I had those, I wouldn't have had a problem in the first place. But after a lot of digging, I eventually stumbled onto a video from a channel called Aki that held the key to solving this problem. Special thank you to Toxic Oxygen from the Ocarina of Time speedrunning Discord for helping explain part of this trick that I was confused about. And get ready, because this might be the weirdest trick of the entire playthrough. I headed for Lon Lon Ranch. I went over to this wall and hovered over it. This is the wall you normally jump over with Epona to escape the ranch with her. Even though I never got Epona's song, by hovering over this wall, the game assumed I got over it the normal way, and I can actually get Epona out of the ranch. I can't call her with the song, but she's perfectly usable. Once I had Epona, I went to Lake Hylia and went to this spot across from the lab. I walked forward into the Gossip Stone, and then immediately stopped and jumped off Epona, and got into the water before the text box went away. This allowed me to remove the sword from the B button. Why is that important? Well, if you don't have an item on B, the game allows you to use items from the C buttons while riding Epona. So for example, you can use the Ocarina to basically fall through Epona, and then she'll be running around separately from Link, and you'll kind of be controlling both of them. If you press A, Link warps back over to Epona. This might seem like just a fun little oddity, but this mechanic was actually incredibly crucial to beating the game. I headed back to Lon Lon Ranch. Now that I had technically done the Epona escape, the ranch was in the state that comes after that, where Milan is now standing by the field instead of Ingo, and you can talk to her to play a minigame. I ran for the jumpable wall on the eastern side of the map on Epona, and just before she jumped over, I used the Ocarina, and Link fell off of her. When I put the Ocarina away, Epona jumped over the wall, but Link didn't go with her, which meant I didn't load into Hyrule Field. I pulled out the hookshot, then used the Ocarina again, and then put it away. The camera was locked on Epona, so I used the minimap to navigate northwest of where I was, which eventually snapped the camera back over to Link. Once the camera was following Link again, I oriented myself so that Malon was right in front of me, and then I turned towards the screen and backwalked towards her. Because of the weird state the game was in, the camera didn't center behind Link when I held Z, so I backwalked by holding up on the stick instead. Once I got close to Malon, I pressed A to talk to her, and then mashed B to get through her text and accept the minigame. At a certain point during this conversation, the camera suddenly snaps back over to Epona, and Link teleports over to her shortly after this happens. This puts him over the wall with her, which means you load into Hyrule Field. If you close the text box during the sequence of events, but do it too late, then the same thing happens. Close the text box too early, and you'll load into Malon's minigame before that happens. But if you close the text box on the exact right frame, you warp straight to Hyrule Castle, right outside of Zelda's courtyard. I headed in, talked to Zelda, watched the cutscenes with their amazing camera angles, and then talked to Impa to finally get Zelda's lullaby. With it, I headed up Death Mountain, played it at the Fairy Fountain, and, after an entire playthrough without it, finally got my hands on magic. I now had everything I needed to beat the game, but since I'd gone to so much effort to get Zelda's lullaby, I wanted to profit from it as much as I could. So I went into the Death Mountain crater, and went to the fountain there to double the size of my magic meter. Then I went back to the outside of Ganon's castle, and clipped into the fairy fountain there to get the double defense upgrade without the golden gauntlets, using a very similar trick to the Shadow Temple. And finally, although it had nothing to do with getting Zelda's lullaby, I finally went back to the Deku Tree and got the Kokiri's Emerald from the boss room, getting the reward from the first dungeon last. And with that, it was time for the final battle. Since I had already been to the tower earlier to get the clip of me fighting Ganondorf without magic, it was a simple battle-free climb. And when I got to Ganondorf, after he made me do all that crazy stuff just to get Zelda's lullaby, I wanted to exact my revenge. So I defeated him in a single cycle, and then beat Ganon without taking damage. I'd say that's a suitable punishment for what I had to go through to get to this point. And with that, the adventure was over. You can indeed beat the Legend of Zelda Fairy Ocarina using only Adult Link. It's kind of funny, when I initially got those comments a few months ago suggesting I do this, I thought at first that it wouldn't be very difficult or interesting, but in the end, I'd say this was even more crazy than doing it as young Link at some points. Some of the tricks I had to do to get around using things I didn't have were nuts, and even though I could have done the glitch to get Zelda's lullaby much earlier, I didn't know about that trick until I used it, and I think things ended up being a lot more interesting without it. If you want to try this yourself, this entire playthrough was done on the Nintendo Switch version, so I don't think you'd have any issues doing anything I did here on any version of the game you happen to own. I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.